When we think of the American frontier, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a grand, sweeping image of wide open plains, rugged pioneers in covered wagons, and the promise of a brand new life. Hollywood and countless novels have painted a picture of adventure, bravery, and limitless freedom. It's the quintessential American story of manifest destiny and taming the Wild West. But beneath this romanticized surface lies a much darker, more complicated reality. The frontier wasn't just a place of opportunity. It was also a landscape of profound fear, brutal conflict, and immense human suffering. This was a world where different cultures collided with devastating force. The clash over land, resources, and sheer survival ignited a cycle of violence that left deep scars on everyone involved. There was no simple story of good versus evil. It was a chaotic, desperate struggle where survival often meant inflicting pain on others. And among the most heartbreaking and overlooked chapters of this era are the stories of women who were taken captive. These were women from both sides of the conflict, settler and native, who were forcibly removed from their homes, families, and everything they knew. Imagine one day living your life, surrounded by your community, and the next, you are thrust into a completely alien world. This was the reality for captive women. Raids, which were a brutal fact of life on the frontier, often resulted in women and children being taken. For the captives, these individuals could be used as bargaining chips, integrated into the tribe to replace lost family members, or used for labor. For the women taken, it was the beginning of an unimaginable ordeal. They were stripped of their names, their language, their clothes, and their identity, forced to adapt to a new culture under the most traumatic circumstances imaginable. One of the most famous, and perhaps misunderstood, stories is that of Cynthia Ann Parker. At just 9 years old, she was captured during a Comanche raid on her family's fort in Texas in 1836. She spent the next 24 years living with the Comanche, eventually marrying a war chief, Peter Nokana, and giving birth to 3 children, including the famous Quanah Parker, who would become the last great chief of the Comanche people. Cynthia Ann, renamed Nadua, fully assimilated into the tribe. She forgot English, embraced their customs, and considered herself Comanche. But her story didn't end there. In 1860, she was rescued by Texas Rangers during a raid. But for Nadua, it wasn't a rescue. It was a second capture. She was forcibly returned to a white society she no longer recognized and separated from her 2 sons forever. Despite repeated attempts to escape and rejoin her Comanche family, she was held against her will. She spent the last decade of her life in deep grief, a stranger in her own birth culture, mourning the loss of her husband and children until her death. Her story shatters the simple narrative of a grateful captive being returned to civilization. It shows a woman caught between 2 worlds, belonging to neither, and ultimately destroyed by the conflict. And this experience wasn't unique to settler women. Native American women and children were also captured and forced into servitude in settler communities. Their stories often lost to history. The emotional and psychological toll on these captives was immense. They faced a constant struggle for survival, navigating complex social rules in a culture they didn't understand. Some, like Cynthia Ann Parker, formed new bonds and families, adapting and finding a new sense of belonging. Others endured unspeakable abuse and trauma, living in constant fear. When and if they were returned to their original communities, the ordeal was often far from over. They were frequently met with suspicion and judgment. They were seen as other, tainted by their time with the enemy. Settler women were questioned about their purity and loyalty, while native women returned to their tribes might be seen as having been culturally contaminated. They no longer fit neatly into the societies they had been taken from, leaving them in a painful state of limbo. These stories force us to look beyond the myth of the heroic frontier. They revealed the deep human cost of westward expansion. They show us that history is not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a complex tapestry of individual lives, filled with pain, resilience, and impossible choices. The experiences of these captive women are a powerful reminder of the silent suffering that often lies beneath the surface of our grand national narratives. They are not just footnotes in history. They are central to understanding the true, complicated. Have you ever heard of a people so skilled on horseback they were called the Lords of the Plains? Today, we're diving into the incredible story of the Comanche, a tribe that dominated the vast landscapes of the American Great Plains. Their territory, known as Common Korea, stretched across what we now know as Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and beyond. This wasn't just land to them. It was their home and their hunting ground and the heart of their culture. So, what made the Comanche so powerful? The answer can be summed up in one word: horses. Before the arrival of horses, life on the plains was tough. But once the Comanche mastered these incredible animals, everything changed. They transformed from pedestrian hunter-gatherers into the most formidable light cavalry the continent had ever seen. A Comanche warrior and his horse moved as one, a blur of speed and precision that was unmatched. This mastery allowed them to hunt the mighty buffalo with incredible efficiency, providing food, shelter, and tools for their families. A successful buffalo hunt was a community celebration, a testament to their skill and their deep connection with the land. The Comanche were more than just warriors. They were a deeply spiritual people with a rich social structure. Their society was organized into several autonomous bands, each with its own leaders. While they didn't have a single chief for the entire nation, certain individuals gained immense respect and influence through their wisdom, bravery, and ability to provide for their people. Family was the cornerstone of their society. Children were cherished and taught the skills they would need to survive from a young age. Boys learned to ride, hunt, and fight, while girls learned to manage the household, prepare hides, and gather food. Everyone had a vital role to play in the survival and prosperity of the band. Life on the plains, however, was a constant challenge. The weather could be extreme, from scorching summers to brutal winters. Resources were not always guaranteed, and defending their territory from rivals and encroaching settlers was a matter of life and death. The Comanche were renowned for their ferocity in battle. They were masters of hit-and-run tactics, using their superior mobility to outmaneuver their enemies. Their reputation as warriors was legendary, and for decades, they held sway over their vast domain, shaping the history of the American West in ways we are still understanding today. They weren't just reacting to change. They were actively creating an empire on the plains. Their political and economic influence was immense. The Comanche controlled major trade routes, trading horses, buffalo products, and captives. They were shrewd negotiators and formidable opponents, engaging in complex relationships with other tribes, as well as with Spanish, French, and later, American settlers. This network of trade and conflict created a dynamic and often volatile frontier. Understanding the Comanche is to understand the story of adaptation, resilience, and power. It's a story of a people who, for over a century, were the undisputed masters of their world, leaving a legacy that continues to echo through the history of the Great Plains. The story of the Comanche is a powerful reminder of the rich and complex histories of Native American peoples. Their legacy is one of strength, adaptation, and an unbreakable bond with the land they called home. Thanks for Imagine stepping back in time to the 1800s. A vast, untamed American West stretches out before you, a landscape of breathtaking beauty and immense promise for thousands of people back east, and even across the ocean. This was the land of opportunity, a chance to start fresh, to own a piece of the world and build a future. This powerful idea sparked one of the largest migrations in American history. The westward expansion. Families packed their entire lives into covered wagons, dreaming of fertile soil, gold in the hills, and the freedom of the frontier. They were driven by hope, by hardship, and by a belief in what they called manifest destiny. The idea that it was their nation's undeniable right to expand from coast to coast. As they pushed west, they weren't just moving across empty land. They were building a new world. One log cabin, one farm, one dusty town at a time. But this land was not empty. For countless generations, it was home. Hundreds of distinct Native American tribes, each with its own rich culture, language, and spiritual connection to the land, had lived in harmony with this environment. The Cheyenne hunted bison on the Great Plains, the Navajo herded sheep in the canyons of the Southwest, and the Sioux held the Black Hills as sacred. This wasn't just a place they lived. It was the core of their identity, the source of their sustenance, and the resting place of their ancestors. So, what happened when these two worlds collided? It was a clash of epic proportions, not just of people, but of fundamentally different ways of life. For the settlers, land was a commodity, something to be owned, fenced, and farmed. A deed and a title proved it was yours. For native tribes, the concept of owning land was completely foreign. The land was a shared resource, a spiritual provider that belonged to everyone and no one. You couldn't sell the earth any more than you could sell the sky. This fundamental misunderstanding was the source of so much conflict. Treaties were made, but they were often written in a language and with legal concepts that were totally alien to the tribes. Settlers, hungry for more land, frequently ignored the boundaries that had been agreed upon. The U.S. government, eager to support the expansion, often broke its own promises, pushing tribes onto smaller and smaller parcels of land called reservations. Communication was almost non-existent. Imagine trying to negotiate a peace treaty when you don't speak the same language, don't share the same values, and have completely different ideas about what truth and honor even mean. On both sides, fear and suspicion grew. Settlers saw native warriors as a threat to their families and their new homes. Native tribes saw the endless stream of wagons and railroads as a force that was destroying their way of life, killing the bison they depended on, and desecrating their sacred sites. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a complex and often tragic chapter in history, filled with acts of incredible bravery and terrible violence from all sides. Settlers were trying to build a better life for their children. Native Americans were fighting desperately to protect their homes, their families, and a culture that had existed for thousands of years. Understanding this period means looking beyond the simple Cowboy Sandines narrative. It means recognizing the humanity of everyone involved, the dreams that drove them, and the fears that haunted them. It's a story about the collision of dreams, the deep scars left on the land and its people, and the complex legacy. Imagine you're living on the edge of a vast, untamed wilderness. The year is 1870. Your nearest neighbor is miles away, and the only law is the one you make for yourself. This was the reality for countless settlers, soldiers, and Native American tribes on the American frontier. It was a world defined by constant tension, where survival often depended on your ability to defend your home, your family, and your resources. Today, we're rediving deep into one of the most brutal and misunderstood aspects of this era, the frontier raid. What exactly was a raid? It wasn't a formal battle with organized armies. Instead, it was a swift, often brutal, strike carried out by a small, mobile group. But why did they happen? The reasons were as complex and varied as the people involved. Let's break it down. First, and perhaps most obviously, was resource scarcity. On the vast plains, horses weren't just for transportation. They were a symbol of wealth, a tool for hunting, and a crucial asset in warfare. A successful horse raid could cripple an enemy or dramatically elevate a warrior's status within his own tribe. Similarly, raids for food, weapons, and other essential supplies were common, especially when treaties were broken and government rations failed to arrive, leaving entire communities on the brink of starvation. It was a desperate measure in a desperate time. Then there was the powerful and tragic cycle of revenge. The frontier was a tinderbox of cultures clashing. A perceived injustice, an attack on a village, or the killing of a family member would almost inevitably trigger a retaliatory strike. This eye-for-an-eye mentality fueled a seemingly endless spiral of violence. An army patrol might attack a native camp in response to a raid on a settlement, and in turn, the warriors from that camp would seek vengeance on the soldiers or nearby settlers. Each act of violence was a seed for the next, making lasting peace feel like an impossible dream. We also can't ignore the role of broken promises. Throughout the 19th century, numerous treaties were signed between the U.S. government and Native American nations. These agreements promised land, protection, and provisions. But time and time again, these treaties were violated by settlers hungry for land, by miners chasing gold, or even by the government itself. When these agreements were ignored and their lands were encroached upon, some tribes felt they had no choice but to fight back. Raids became a form of resistance, a way to protest the theft of their ancestral homes and the destruction of their way of life. Now, it's crucial to understand that this was not a one-sided affair. Settler militias and even units of the U.S. Army also conducted raids on native villages, often with devastating consequences. These attacks were sometimes framed as punitive expeditions, meant to enforce treaties or punish tribes for raiding settlements. However, they were frequently indiscriminate, leading to massacres of women, children, and the elderly. Events like the Sand Creek Massacre or the Washita River Massacre are dark chapters in American history, where the lines between justice and vengeance were horribly blurred. In this chaotic and violent environment, the ones who suffered the most were often the innocent. A homesteader family, trying to build a new life, could lose everything in a single night. A peaceful Native American village, uninvolved in any conflict, could be wiped out in a punitive army raid. The constant threat of attack created a culture of fear and mistrust that poisoned relations for generations. It hardened hearts on all sides, making empathy and understanding rare commodities. The story of the frontier raid is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a complex and heartbreaking story of survival, desperation, cultural collision, and a cycle of violence that was incredibly difficult to break. It reminds us that behind the historical dates and grand narratives, there were real people, settlers, soldiers, and Native Americans, all caught in the turbulent currents of a nation's expansion. Understanding this history, in all its brutal honesty, is essential. Imagine the world you know vanishing in an instant. For countless people, this was a terrifying reality. Picture a quiet settlement, nestled in the early morning mist or under the cloak of a moonless night. Life is peaceful, predictable. Families are asleep in their homes, children dreaming, the rhythm of daily life humming along. Then, suddenly, chaos erupts. The attack comes without warning. It's swift, brutal, and disorienting. Shouts tear through the silence. The air, once calm, fills with smoke and the screams of your neighbors, your friends. You're jolted from sleep, not by the rising sun, but by the terrifying sounds of an invasion. Panic is a physical thing, a cold grip on your heart. You run, but where? Every direction seems to lead to more danger. The familiar paths of your village become a maze of confusion and fear. In these frantic moments, the fabric of society is ripped apart. A woman, reaching for her husband's hand, is torn away. A child, crying for their mother, is snatched from her arms. Parents see their children for what could be the last time, their faces etched with terror. There's no time for goodbyes, no time for one last embrace. In a heartbeat, families are shattered, their bonds broken by overwhelming force. The captures were designed to create maximum confusion, to prevent any organized resistance, and to instill a deep, paralyzing fear. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated operations. The attackers, often armed and organized, knew exactly what they were doing. They worked with chilling efficiency, rounding people up like livestock. Men, women, and children were herded together, their individual identities stripped away. They were no longer a father, a daughter, a respected elder. They were now captives, commodities in a cruel and inhuman trade. The emotional trauma of this separation is almost impossible to comprehend. The sudden loss, the uncertainty, the sheer helplessness. It's a wound that would never fully heal. Think about the psychological impact. One moment, you're home, surrounded by love and community. The next, you are a prisoner, being forced on a journey to an unknown destination, for an unknown purpose. The shock is immense. Your entire world, everything that gave your life meaning and structure, has been obliterated. The fear isn't just for your own life, but for the lives of your loved ones. Are they safe? Are they even alive? These agonizing questions would haunt them, echoing in their minds during the long, brutal march that often followed. This experience of sudden and violent capture was the first step in a long and horrific process. It was a deliberate breaking of the human spirit, an attempt to erase history, culture, and family ties. But while the attackers could shatter communities, they could not always extinguish the flame of human resilience, the memories of home, of family, of a life. Before the chaos would become a source of inner strength for many, a reason to endure in the face of unimaginable hardship. Understanding this initial moment of capture is crucial to grasping the full scope of this dark chapter in human history. It's a story of profound loss, but also one of incredible survival. Thank you for watching. If you found this perspective valuable, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. Imagine the deafening silence of a train station, not empty, but filled with the unspoken goodbyes of 1,000 hearts. This was the reality for countless women, torn from their homes, their families, their entire worlds. Separation wasn't just a word. It was a physical ache, a constant, gnawing pain that settled deep in the soul. Many would stand on crowded platforms, watching the faces of their husbands, their children, their parents, fade into the distance, never to be seen again. This single, brutal moment would replay in their minds for years, a ghost of a life that was once theirs. The journey that followed was a descent into a world of unknownness. Was he safe? Did she eat today? Will I ever feel their embrace again? These questions became a relentless storm in their minds, with no answers to bring them peace. Each day was a battle against the crushing weight of uncertainty. Some clutched faded photographs, their only tangible link to a life that felt like a dream. Others wrote letters that would never be sent, pouring their grief onto paper that could offer no reply. The not knowing was a unique form of torture, a hope that flickered so faintly it was almost indistinguishable from despair. They had to learn to live with this void, to function, to breathe, while a part of them remained forever frozen in that last, heartbreaking moment of farewell. And then came the silence, a new kind of silence. Arriving in a foreign land, they were plunged into a sea of unfamiliar sounds, a language they couldn't grasp. The simple act of asking for directions, for food, for help, became an impossible task. Imagine the terror of being sick and unable to describe your pain, or the frustration of being misunderstood, your intentions misinterpreted. Fear was a constant companion, but they couldn't even voice it. They couldn't scream, they couldn't explain, they couldn't connect. Their own words, their thoughts, their very identity, felt trapped behind an invisible wall. Language, the bridge that connects human beings, was gone. This isolation was profound. Without the ability to communicate, they were often perceived as simple, or worse, unintelligent. Their rich inner lives, their knowledge, their stories, were locked away. They navigated their new world through gestures, through observation, through a painful and slow process of trial and error. The loneliness was suffocating. In a crowd, they were alone. At a table filled with chatter, they were in silence. This silence wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy blanket of isolation. It forced them to retreat into themselves, to build walls, to protect a heart that was already so wounded. Their voice, once a tool for laughter, song, and conversation, was now only for the thoughts they could never share. But within this crushing silence, something extraordinary began to happen. Resilience, a force as powerful as any language, began to take root. They learned to speak with their eyes, to communicate with a shared look of understanding with another woman who knew their pain. They found strength in shared tasks, in the rhythm of work, in the simple act of helping one another. They became masters of observation, learning the nuances of a new culture without a single word being spoken. Their silence was not a void of thought, but a space where incredible strength, courage, and a deep, unwavering hope were forged. They were not just surviving, they were silently, powerfully, fighting for a future, for the memory of those they loved, and for the hope that one day, their voices— Imagine being torn from everything you've ever known, your home, your family, your life. Suddenly, you're a captive, forced to march into an unknown future. This was the harrowing reality for countless women throughout history. Their journey began not with a choice, but with force. A long, grueling trek crossed vast, open plains. Stretched before them, a seemingly endless expanse of uncertainty. The sun beat down relentlessly during the day, and the nights brought a biting cold that seeped into their bones. There was no shelter from the elements, just the unforgiving sky above. The physical toll was immense. Each day was a battle for survival. Food was scarce, barely enough to sustain them. A small piece of dried meat, a handful of grain— these were luxuries. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion, weakening their bodies and spirits. Water was just as precious, and often just as rare. The exhaustion was bone deep. They walked from sunrise to sunset, with only a few precious hours of fitful sleep on the hard, cold ground before being forced to rise and do it all again. Their feet became raw and blistered. Their muscles screamed with every step, but they had to keep moving. To fall behind was to risk being left behind, a fate too terrible to contemplate. But the physical hardship was perhaps overshadowed by the psychological torment. Fear was their constant shadow. Fear of the unknown, fear of their captors, fear of what lay at the end of this torturous journey. They didn't know where they were going or why. Were they being taken to a life of servitude? Was this a death march? Every mile that passed was another mile farther from home, another thread cut from the tapestry of their former lives. The familiar landscapes of their homeland faded into a distant memory, replaced by a monotonous and hostile terrain that offered no comfort. They looked at the faces of the other women, seeing their own fear and despair reflected back at them. In these shared glances, a silent sisterhood was forged. They would offer a supporting arm to someone who stumbled, share a morsel of their meager rations, or whisper a word of encouragement when hope seemed lost. These small acts of humanity were lifelines in a sea of cruelty. They drew strength from one another, a quiet defiance against the dehumanizing conditions they were forced to endure. They were more than just captives. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters, clinging to their identities and their dignity with every ounce of strength they possessed. These journeys were not just a physical displacement, but an attempt to erase their culture and their spirit. They were stripped of their possessions, their freedom, and their connection to their ancestors. Yet, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can prove astonishingly resilient. The stories of these women, though born of immense suffering, are also tales of incredible strength and endurance. They are a powerful reminder of the injustices that have occurred throughout history and the importance of remembering those who suffered them. By sharing these stories, we honor their memory and ensure that the lessons from their ordeal are never forgotten. Imagine stepping into a world utterly different from your own. For those who found themselves inside Comanche camps in the 19th century, this was their reality. Everything, from the language spoken to the way food was prepared, was a sudden and total immersion into an unfamiliar culture. Survival depended on one thing: learning fast. Life in a Comanche camp was governed by a complex set of unwritten rules and social customs. For newcomers, especially women captives, navigating this new society was a high-stakes challenge. A simple mistake, a misunderstanding of etiquette, could lead to harsh consequences. It might mean a stern punishment, or it could mean going without food, a precious resource in the often harsh environment of the plains. The community was tight-knit, and fitting in was not just a social goal, it was a necessity for survival. The process of assimilation was profound and often began with the stripping away of one's old identity. Many captives were given new Comanche names, a symbolic act that marked the beginning of their new life. This wasn't just a change in title. It was a signal that their past life, their family, their entire history was expected to be left behind. Forgetting who you were was a heavy burden, a psychological trial that accompanied the physical challenges of daily life. What did this daily life look like? It was a life of constant motion and hard work, dictated by the seasons and the movement of the buffalo herds. Women were the backbone of the camp. Their responsibilities were immense and required incredible skill. They tanned hides to make clothing and tipi covers, a laborious process that could take days. They gathered wild plants for food and medicine, learning to identify which were safe and which were not. They butchered animals, cooked meals, and cared for the children. Every task was essential, and every member of the community had a role to play. For a captive woman, mastering these skills was the path to acceptance. Proving her worth through hard work and a willingness to learn could gradually change her status from an outsider to an integrated member of the family unit she was placed in. Some women formed deep bonds with their new families, finding a sense of belonging and even love. They learned the language, not just the words, but the stories, songs, and humor that came with it. They adopted Comanche dress and customs, becoming, in many ways, Comanche themselves. However, this transition was never simple. The memories of a former life, of family left behind, were a constant presence for many. The internal conflict between who they were and who they were becoming was a silent struggle. Some captives fully embraced their new lives, finding a freedom and respect they may not have known before. The Comanche often held women in high regard for their contributions, and a skilled, hard-working woman could earn a position of considerable influence within her family group. Others never stopped looking for a way to escape, clinging to the hope of returning to their old world. The stories of these individuals are incredibly varied and complex. There wasn't one single experience, but thousands of unique personal journeys. Some were eventually traded back to their original communities, only to find they no longer fit in there either, caught between two worlds. They had been changed forever by their time with the Comanche. Studying this period of history forces us to look beyond simple narratives. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It tests about how people find ways to build lives and create connections, even in the most challenging of circumstances. The lives of these women within the Comanche camps are a powerful testament to the complexities of cultural exchange and personal identity. Thank you so much. Have you ever wondered what daily life was like for those living on the fringes of society, far from home? Imagine waking up, not in your own bed, but in a world entirely different from the one you knew. For many captives in historical times, this was their reality. Their days were a relentless cycle of hard work, a constant struggle for survival in an unfamiliar land. Life was physically demanding, an endless list of chores from sunrise to sunset. The women, in particular, bore a heavy burden. They were integral to the functioning of the camp, their hands never idle. They would rise before the sun to start the cooking fires, preparing meals for the entire group. Their days were spent gathering wild plants, berries, and roots, food that was essential for survival. This wasn't a leisurely walk in the woods. It required deep knowledge of the local environment, knowledge they had to learn quickly to be of use. Another crucial task was the preparation of animal hides. After a successful hunt, the men would bring back the game, but it was the women who undertook the grueling process of skinning the animals and tanning the hides. This was messy, smelly, and physically exhausting work. The hides had to be scraped clean of all flesh and fat, then stretched, treated, and softened until they were pliable enough to be made into clothing, shelter, and other essential items. Their hands were often raw and tired, but the work never stopped. Beyond these tasks, they were also the primary caregivers. They looked after the children, not just their own if they had them, but all the children in the camp. They were responsible for feeding them, keeping them safe, and teaching them the ways of the tribe. And when the time came to move, which happened frequently as they followed animal herds or sought fresh resources, the women were responsible for packing up the entire camp. They would dismantle the shelters, pack all the belongings, and carry heavy loads to the new location. It was a life of constant motion and constant labor. The treatment these captives received varied greatly. It's a complex picture, not easily painted in black and white. In some families, life was incredibly strict. Captives were seen as laborers, their existence defined by the work they could provide. They might face harsh words, meager rations, and a constant feeling of being an outsider, always watched and judged. There was little room for error, and the consequences could be severe. They were living on a knife's edge, their well-being dependent on the whims of their captors. However, it wasn't always a story of unrelenting hardship. In other families, there were surprising moments of kindness, small glimmers of humanity that made an unbearable situation just a little more tolerable. A woman might share a piece of her own food, an elder might teach a traditional skill with patience, or a child might offer a simple, innocent smile. These small gestures could be a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, compassion could still be found. Some captives were even adopted into the family, treated more like a distant relative than a servant. But no matter the treatment, one thing was always missing: freedom. Every sunrise was a painful reminder that they were not home. They were living in a world that wasn't theirs, speaking a language that was foreign to their tongue, and following customs that felt alien. They might have a roof over their heads and food in their bellies, but their hearts longed for the familiar faces and places they had been torn away from. The hope of one day returning home was a constant, burning ember in their hearts, a secret they carried through every long day of labor and every lonely night. This yearning for home, for freedom, was the silent, invisible burden they carried with them, heavier than any physical load. It was the backdrop to every moment of their captive lives. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories that explore the complexities of human history. See you next time.